The desert night was colder than it had any right to be. Out beyond the canyons, coyotes howled at the rising moon, and the dry wind pushed through the scattered brush like whispers of old ghosts. It was the kind of land that stripped a man bare, made him honest, or broke him. On a lonely ranch where silence hung heavier than the stars above, one man thought he had seen about everything. That was until he found the girl. She wasn't supposed to be alive. Her body had been carried by the current of a shallow arroyo, half buried in mud and stones, bruised from shoulder to hip, the kind of wounds a person didn't walk away from. When he dragged her out of the water and onto the bank, he expected her chest to stay still, her eyes closed forever. But the girl was tougher than death itself. Somewhere between the ancient blood of her people and the fire in her spirit, she still clung to life. He had no reason to bring her back to his ranch. No reason except that something in her face, calm, even in the shadow of pain, reminded him of promises he'd once made and failed to keep. He'd lost too much already to leave another soul behind. So he rode back with her slumped across his saddle, the horse restless beneath the extra weight. The horizon bleeding with the last of the sun. When she awoke, the walls around her were not of her people. Rough-cut pine planks, a single lantern hissing in the corner. A bed that smelled of dust and leather oil. This was the world of a rancher, not an Apache. For a moment, confusion played across her face, then fear. Her eyes darted to the door, then to the window, measuring escape. She had expected the cold embrace of the earth, not this strange wooden room that felt more like a trap than a shelter. The rancher tried to speak gently, but his voice was rough from years of dust and smoke. He told her she was safe, that no harm would come. But words meant little to a girl who had already seen betrayal dressed in fine promises. Her people were fading under the weight of rifles and iron tracks. Safety was a thing spoken by men who took everything away. Still, she was weak. She could feel the trembling in her bones, the heat of fever pressing into her skull. For all her strength, her body betrayed her. She closed her eyes as if willing herself to vanish. She would rather drift away into the black than wake in a stranger's bed with no weapon, no family, no way back to the mountains. But fate is cruel in the way it binds lives together. The rancher left water by her side, set food within reach, and stepped out to tend his cattle. He should have locked the door. He didn't, and when she finally opened her eyes again, the moon was higher, silver pouring across the floorboards. The room was empty, the house quiet, but her fear was not. She pulled herself up slowly, her body aching, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her mind told her she had no choice, escape now or die here later. Her eyes landed on the glint of steel by the bedside table, a knife meant for chores, not for war. Still, it was sharp enough. Her fingers curled around the handle, the weight familiar, comforting. When the rancher returned, the door creaked open to a sight he hadn't expected. There she was, perched on the edge of the bed, hair falling loose around her face, eyes dark and unyielding. The knife was steady in her hand, pointed at his chest. She didn't speak, but the message was clear. For a long moment, neither moved. The lantern hissed. Outside, the desert wind rattled the shutters. The rancher raised his hand slowly, palms open, as if facing down a wild mustang that might bolt at the slightest wrong step. He saw the tremor in her arm, not from fear but from weakness, from wounds that hadn't healed. And he knew one wrong word might push her past the point of return. He wanted to tell her he meant no harm, that he had carried her from death's edge, that he had given her shelter when the land would have swallowed her whole. But he also knew words were thin shields against the weight of history, against scars carved deeper than flesh. This was no simple girl in need of saving. This was someone who had already chosen to die once, who had closed her eyes ready to meet the darkness. Now she sat in his cabin, alive against her own will, blade catching the lantern glow, her gaze fixed and unblinking. The rancher stood at the doorway, heart pounding harder than any gunfight, because this was a battle fought without bullets. It was survival balanced on the edge of silence. The night stretched longer with every heartbeat. Somewhere outside, the coyotes cried again, as if mocking the fragile peace between them. The rancher knew he had only one chance to say the right thing, to reach past her mistrust, past the pain that chained her. Yet before he could speak, her lips parted, the knife shifting just slightly in her grip. What she said next would decide whether blood stained the rancher's floor before dawn, or whether fate had dragged them together for a reason neither could yet see. The knife lingered in the space between them, a bridge of steel and shadows, as the lantern light flickered lower. The knife trembled only slightly in her hand, but her eyes were steady. She looked at him as though she could carve truth from his silence, daring him to take a step closer. The rancher kept his palms raised, the old boards groaning under his boots as he stayed rooted in place. He had been stared down before, men with revolvers, men who wanted his cattle, men who would kill him for less than a day's work. Yet nothing in his past felt as sharp as the moment he now stood in. Caught between her mistrust and his own desperate need to prove he was no enemy, he saw how her fingers whitened on the knife handle. Her arm shook with exhaustion, but not with fear. The girl was running on willpower alone, held together by a spirit forged harder than iron. He thought of the river where he found her. The way she had seemed more spirit than flesh, half gone already. It was strange how someone so close to death could sit before him now, alive and ready to fight with nothing but sheer defiance. The rancher tried to speak soft, though his voice came out rough as gravel. He told her she could keep the knife, that he wouldn't lay a hand on her. He said the food was hers, the water too, and that if she wished to leave come morning he wouldn't stop her. His words hung in the air, fragile, unsure if they would mean anything to her. Her gaze flicked toward the lantern's flame, then back to him. She did not lower the blade. For her, words were not enough. Too many promises had been broken. Too many voices had spoken of peace while bringing only ruin. She had seen enough men to know their tongues could be smoother than river stones, but sharper than barbed wire. She held his eyes a long time, and then she finally spoke. Her voice was raspy, the sound of a throat dry with fever, but her words carried weight. She asked him why he had not left her in the arroyo. She asked him what he wanted from her. Simple questions, yet spoken like challenges. The rancher had no good answer ready. He said the land was cruel enough without men making it worse. He said he had lost too much already to let death take another soul he could save. It was not a full truth, not the deepest truth, but it was as close as he dared. Her hand trembled again, the knife dipping just slightly. She did not believe him fully, but some piece of her must have heard something more than a lie. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, still clutching the knife, and leaned back onto the edge of the bed. She did not take her eyes off him, not even for a blink. The rancher lowered his hand slowly, like easing down a skittish horse. He stepped back toward the doorframe, giving her the space she needed. Then he stopped and looked at her again. In that moment, he realized she was not much more than a girl. A warrior's eyes, yes, but a body thin from hunger, bruises marking her skin, wounds half healed. He wondered how many miles she had walked before the arroyo took her down. He wondered if anyone was still out there searching for her, or if she truly had no one left. Outside, the coyotes sang again. He muttered that the desert didn't give second chances often, that if she had found one tonight she ought to use it. Then he left her with the knife, closing the door but not latching it. She sat there for a long time, staring at the shadows. The room smelled of leather and wood smoke. Nothing familiar, nothing of her people. Yet there was no cruelty in the way he had left the food by her side. No chains, no rope, no locked door. She hated herself for noticing, for feeling her body betray her hunger as she reached for the bread. She ate in silence, every bite heavy with mistrust. Through the thin walls, she could hear him moving about, the scrape of boots, the soft clang of iron tools being set down. She thought about slipping away into the night, but her legs ached too much, and her head spun when she tried to stand. Escape was not yet possible. She hated that truth more than anything. The rancher built a small fire outside and sat by it, staring into the flames. His thoughts drifted to the past, to a time when the valley had been full of promise. Before the war came, before land and blood became currency, he remembered faces now gone, voices silenced by rifles. He had tried to live quiet since then, to keep his ranch small and his life even smaller. Yet somehow, the desert had laid this girl at his door, forcing him into a story larger than himself as the night deepened. The girl inside pressed her back against the wall and clutched the knife to her chest. Her eyelids burned with exhaustion, but she fought sleep, knowing dreams could betray her faster than any man. She thought of the last time she had seen her people. The campfires burning low, the warning cries echoing through the canyon. She remembered running, the sound of hooves pounding behind her, the sharp crack of rifles splitting the night. Then the river. Pain. The cold water carrying her like driftwood. She had thought that was the end. Yet here she was, trapped in a stranger's cabin, alive when she had already made peace with death. The lantern dimmed, the wick burning down to ash. Shadows crept higher on the walls, and the rancher finally came back inside. He moved quietly, not looking at her as he set another log in the stove. The warmth filled the small cabin. For a moment the girl felt her body sag against the bed, her grip on the knife loosening. She forced her eyes open again, reminding herself she could not trust the comfort. He spoke without turning toward her, telling her the land was not kind to anyone alone. He said the desert swallowed the strong and the weak alike. He told her she had a choice come morning, but that staying might be safer than wandering back into the wild with no horse, no food, and no allies. She gave no answer. Only silence. He didn't push her. He let the stove crackle, the warmth settle into the air. And then he stretched out on the floor by the far wall, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He left the door unlocked again, a gesture she could not understand. No man left himself vulnerable unless he was either foolish or honest. Sleep came for them both, uneasy and shallow. The night carried whispers through the cracks of the cabin, and the stars turned slowly overhead. Neither knew what the morning would bring, only that their fates had tangled together in ways neither could escape. And as dawn began to pale the horizon, the girl sat awake still, knife resting in her lap, her thoughts dark and restless. She knew she would have to decide soon whether to trust the man who had dragged her back from death or cut her way free before his kindness turned too. Chains. The rancher stirred, unaware that her eyes had never closed, unaware that the blade still lingered between them like a question no dawn could answer. The first light of morning crept through the cracks in the shutters, painting thin gold lines across the cabin floor. The rancher stirred where he had slept against the wall, pulling himself upright with a quiet groan. His back ached from the hard planks, but he didn't move quickly, didn't make sudden noises that might startle her. He knew she had stayed awake most of the night, because he had felt her eyes on him even in the darkness. Now, as he lifted his hat from his face, he found her still sitting on the bed, knife in hand, shoulders tense. Neither spoke. For a long moment, it was only the sound of the stove cooling, the faint creak of wood as the wind shifted outside. Finally, he broke the silence with a simple offer of food. His voice was low, calm, as though speaking to a wild horse that hadn't yet decided whether to bolt or stay. He placed bread and a strip of jerky on the table, then stepped back to give her space. She did not move at first. Her eyes stayed on him, sharp and untrusting. But hunger was a cruel master. Eventually, she slid forward, still gripping the knife, and reached for the food. She ate quickly, each bite small but desperate. The rancher turned away, giving her the dignity of pretending not to notice her need. When she finished, she spoke for the first time since the night before. She asked him what he wanted in return. Her voice carried both suspicion and exhaustion, as though she already expected some hidden debt waiting to be collected. The rancher shook his head, saying he wanted nothing. He told her again that she could leave whenever she wished. His words carried no demand, but the girl narrowed her eyes. In her world, nothing came free, and no man offered help without expecting something later. The day stretched long and dry. The rancher went about his chores, tending to the cattle, repairing a broken section of fence, hauling water from the well. The girl stayed close to the cabin, still too weak to risk walking far. She watched him through the doorway, studying his movements, trying to understand him. He seemed steady, a man who lived by routine, his body hardened by years of labor under the sun. He spoke little, but every gesture carried a patience that confused her. As the sun climbed higher, The land revealed its harshness. Heat shimmered on the horizon, and dust lifted in swirls across the dry plain. The girl knew this land well enough to understand its cruelty. Without water, without shelter, no one lasted long. Part of her hated to admit it, but the rancher had been right. Leaving now, with no supplies or horse, would mean certain death. Yet staying meant trusting someone she was raised to see as an enemy. By late afternoon, she stepped outside for the first time. The knife still hidden under the folds of the blanket she had wrapped around her shoulders. She moved carefully, her steps slow, as though the ground might betray her. The rancher glanced up from where he was hammering a fence post, but he did not approach her. He only tipped his hat slightly and went back to his work. That small act unsettled her more than if he had confronted her. She could not understand his restraint. While she stood in the doorway, the wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats. Her body stiffened instantly, every muscle ready for flight. The rancher's hammer stilled as he turned toward the horizon. The dust plume was faint but visible riders moving fast across the plain. He muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. He told her to get back inside. She hesitated, unsure if this was another trick. But the urgency in his tone left no room for doubt. She slipped back into the cabin, crouching low, her grip tightening on the knife once more. From inside, she could hear him moving quickly, pulling his rifle from where it leaned near the corral. The riders drew closer, and she pressed her ear to the crack of the shutter. She saw 3 men on horseback, dust covering their coats, rifles slung across their saddles. Their voices carried as they reined in near the ranch. One of them laughed, a harsh, dry sound. They asked if he had seen anyone crossing his land. They asked about an Apache girl, wounded, said to have escaped a raid not far from the river. Her heart hammered in her chest. These men were hunting her. She felt her breath catch, the knife shaking in her grip. She turned her eyes toward the rancher outside, waiting to see what he would say. He stood tall, but not aggressive, his rifle resting against his shoulder. He told them he had seen nothing, only dust and cattle. His tone was calm, but his eyes never left theirs. The men pressed harder, asking if he was hiding her, warning that she was dangerous, that she had spilled blood. They said her people had burned wagons, left bodies in the canyon. Their words were sharp, filled with venom, but she heard the lie in them. The rancher didn't flinch. He told them his land was his own, that no one crossed it without his say. The riders studied him, trying to read his face, then finally cursed and turned their horses toward the open plain. Dust rose behind them as they rode away, their voices fading into the wind. Inside the cabin, she sank back against the wall, her breath ragged. Relief washed through her, but it tangled with confusion. Why had he lied for her? Why would he risk angering men who clearly carried rifles and power? She had no answer, only more questions. When he returned, his expression was unreadable. He leaned his rifle back by the door, then finally met her gaze. He said nothing of what had just happened, only told her the desert was wide and danger came from more than just the sun. She wanted to demand answers, to ask him why he protected her, but her pride held her tongue. Instead, she turned away, clutching the knife closer to her chest. That night, sleep refused to come easily. She lay awake on the bed, her mind spinning with images of the riders, of the river, of the rancher standing firm against them. Outside, he paced by the firelight, his shadow long against the ground. He did not rest either, his body tense as though he expected the riders to return. As hours passed, the silence between them grew heavy. She thought of her people, of the camp she had lost, of the voices she would never hear again. She thought of her own decision to close her eyes and let death take her in the river, only for this man to drag her back against her will. Perhaps the spirits had not finished with her yet. Perhaps there was still something she was meant to do, though what, she could not see. The rancher's thoughts traveled elsewhere. He remembered a woman's face long gone, remembered promises he could not keep, and the hollow ache of living alone too many years. This girl was not his responsibility, yet here she was reshaping the quiet world he had built. He wondered if saving her would cost him more than letting her go would have. When dawn came again, both were weary, but neither admitted it. She sat up slowly, knife still close, and watched him move about the cabin. The conflict between them was no longer silent. It had grown into something unspoken but heavy, a tension neither could resolve. She could not forgive the world he came from, and he could not undo the blood that had already been spilled on both sides. Yet their paths were now tangled. She knew it, and so did he. The desert had bound them together, with no easy escape. And as another day began on the lonely ranch, both braced themselves for the weight of what was still to come, for enemies that lingered beyond the horizon, and for the mistrust that sharpened every word and every silence between them. The knife still rested in her hand, rifle still leaned against his door. The storm that would decide their fates was gathering unseen, and both of them felt it pressing closer with each passing breath. The days that followed became a fragile rhythm, though, beneath it, ran a current of unease that neither could ignore. The rancher worked the land, fixing troughs, checking fences, feeding the cattle. The girl stayed close to the cabin, still regaining her strength, but her eyes never stopped watching. She studied every movement he made, every choice he took, as though measuring whether he was a man who could be trusted or one who would betray her when the moment turned. At night, the desert did not sleep. Coyotes prowled closer, their yips echoing across the barren hills. Sometimes the wind carried faint echoes of riders, the creak of saddle leather, the distant thunder of hooves. She would stiffen at those sounds, clutching the knife, ready to vanish into the shadows if the door opened with strangers behind it. The rancher felt it too. He left his rifle within reach at all times. His hat pulled low, but his eyes awake long into the dark hours. Though their words were few, the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken things. Sky bled red over the horizon. She finally asked him why he had risked lying to the riders. He paused, setting aside his work, and said simply that men like them had already taken too much. He would not give them more, not even her. She searched his face, but his eyes gave away nothing. It left her unsettled, because she could not tell if his words came from truth or from the kind of sorrow that no longer cared what happened next. The rancher, for his part, began to see the girl as more than the wounded figure he had carried from the arroyo. She moved with caution, but there was strength in her that went beyond her thin frame. He saw it in her eyes when she scanned the horizon in the way she never ate without saving a piece for later, in the silence that spoke of things she would never reveal. She was not simply a survivor. She was something harder, something shaped by loss and fire. But the desert was not done testing them. The riders returned. It was late afternoon when the dust rose again on the far ridge, the sun beating down so hot the air shimmered. He saw them first, 3 figures this time, swelling into 5, their horses restless, rifles visible against the light. His stomach tightened. He knew men who hunted in packs like this carried trouble in their saddlebags. He told her to stay inside, but she shook her head sharply. Her pride would not allow her to cower behind walls while men searched for her life. She gripped the knife with steady hands, though deep inside she knew it was nothing against rifles. Still, it was better than empty palms. The riders halted at the fence line, dust trailing them like ghosts. Their leader, a broad man with a scar down his cheek, called out. He accused the rancher of harboring an enemy, said the Apache girl was a fugitive, guilty of spilling blood in the canyon, guilty of stealing from settlers. His voice rang out like judgment, heavy and cruel. The rancher stood firm, rifle in hand but not raised. He said his land was his own, and he answered to no one here. His words were steady, but tension coiled in the air like a rattler ready to strike. The scarred man sneered, warning that anyone who sheltered the girl shared her crimes. He gave the rancher until sunrise to hand her over. If not, they would return, and the ranch would burn with him inside it. The girl heard every word through the cracks in the shutter. Her blood pounded in her ears, her body tense with rage. Lies again. More lies from men who had always painted her people as beasts so they could justify the killing. She wanted to burst out and shout the truth, to tell them she was not guilty of the blood they spoke of. But she stayed silent, knowing her voice would mean nothing to men who already judged her guilty. When the riders turned their horses and vanished into the distance, the silence left behind was worse than the noise. The rancher came inside, setting his rifle down slowly. He looked at her, and she knew what he was about to say. She cut him off with a single word: no. She would not leave. She would not run again. If they wanted her, they would have to face her here. The rancher pressed a hand over his face, weary. He told her the men would return with fire, with rifles, maybe with more riders. He said the desert would drink their blood if they stood against that storm. But she held his gaze, fierce and unyielding. She had already lost everything once. Running again would only dishonor the voices of those she had buried in her heart. That night, they prepared in silence. He stacked extra wood near the stove, filled buckets with water, checked and rechecked his rifle. She sharpened her knife against a stone, each scrape loud in the small cabin. Outside, the desert wind shifted, carrying the scent of dust and distance, as though the land itself held its breath. Through the dark hours, both lay awake, listening. Every coyote cry felt closer, every rustle in the grass a warning. She thought of the faces of her family, their laughter around the fire before the raids. She thought of the cold water of the river and the choice she had made to close her eyes. The rancher thought of burned homesteads, of graves dug too shallow, of promises left broken by war. Both carried ghosts that weighed heavy in their chests. And now, those ghosts seemed to gather in the corners of the cabin, waiting to see what dawn would bring. As the first gray light touched the sky, the sound came. Hooves many this time, rolling like thunder across the plain. The girl's breath caught. She tightened her grip on the knife, her heart racing. The rancher rose slowly, pulling his rifle close, his eyes hard. He opened the shutter just a crack, and the sight made his jaw clench. Riders, not 5, but closer to 10, all armed, their horses restless in the rising wind. They came with torches and rifles. Their voices loud, their threats carried across the open land. The scarred man called out again, his tone mocking, telling the rancher this was his last chance. Hand over the girl, or watch the desert swallow everything he had built. The rancher stood at the doorway, rifle steady, shoulders squared. He called back that his land was not theirs to command. The words rang with finality, a line drawn in the dust. The girl stepped to his side, knife in hand, her eyes fierce and unafraid. She would not hide this time. She would face the storm head-on, even if it meant her blood on the ground. The rider shouted, torches flaring in the wind. The cattle lowed nervously, stamping at the dry earth. Dust swirled, the air thick with the scent of smoke and sweat. Every heartbeat stretched long, stretched tight, the space between action and violence thinner than a breath. Inside the cabin, shadows flickered against the walls, thrown by the torches outside. The girl felt her pulse pound in her ears, each beat a drum of war. The rancher's finger brushed the trigger of his rifle, not yet pulling, but ready. The world seemed to narrow to this single moment, this fragile silence before the break. The riders edged closer, their horses tossing their heads, the torches casting wild light across their faces. The scarred man lifted his hand, ready to signal. The girl raised her knife higher, her breath sharp and steady. The rancher braced his feet, the weight of every choice pressing down on him. The desert wind howled, carrying with it the smell of smoke, the crackle of fire, and the promise of blood. The standoff had reached its peak, every soul locked in a tension so fierce the air itself felt ready to shatter. The moment before the storm held, stretched unbearably thin, until it seemed the entire land waited to see which side would make the first move. The scarred man's hand hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed the desert itself froze. The riders' torches whipped in the wind, their horses stamping and tossing their heads as though they too felt the tension straining across the plain. Inside the cabin, the girl and the rancher stood shoulder to shoulder. Bound by silence and by the choice neither could take back. When the hand finally dropped, chaos broke loose. The first torch arced through the air and landed against the fence, flames licking quickly at the dry wood. The rancher fired, the crack of his rifle echoing across the valley, and one rider tumbled from his saddle. The girl leapt forward with a cry, her knife clutched tight. But the rancher caught her arm and pulled her back, knowing steel was no match for rifles at this distance. Bullets slammed into the cabin walls, splinters flying. Smoke rose, fast as fire, spread across the corral, the frightened cattle bawling in panic. The girl's heart pounded, but her fear hardened into resolve. She ran to the back window, watching as riders circled, trying to cut off any chance of escape. The rancher moved steady, reloading with practiced hands, his face grim but focused. He told her to stay low, to use the shadows, but she shook her head. She would not cower. This was not only his fight. The battle stretched into a blur of fire and dust. The rancher's rifle sang again and again, each shot sending a rider scattering or a torch falling to the dirt. The girl, too, found her chance, slipping through the rear of the cabin and striking at one man who had tried to flank them. Her knife caught him by surprise, and though she barely had strength, her courage was enough to drive him back. She returned to the cabin breathless, blood not her own on the blade, her eyes fierce. But the flames were spreading fast. The cattle burst through the burning fence, hooves pounding, scattering into the open desert. The riders cursed, some giving chase, others pressing closer. The rancher knew the fight could not last. He turned to the girl, telling her they needed to leave, to cut through the smoke while there was still cover. She hesitated, torn between rage and survival, but finally nodded. Together they slipped out, moving low through the rising haze. The desert wind turned in their favor, pushing smoke toward the riders, blinding them. The rancher led her along a dry wash, his hand steady on her shoulder, guiding her through the confusion. Shots rang out behind them, but none found their mark. When at last they stumbled clear of the worst of the smoke, they collapsed among the rocks, lungs burning, hearts racing. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire roared behind them, a black cloud rising into the pale sky. The ranch the rancher had built with his own hands was being swallowed by flame. The girl watched his face as he stared back at the smoke, his jaw set hard. She wanted to speak, to tell him she was sorry, but the words felt empty in her throat. He had lost everything again because of her. Finally, he broke the silence. He said the land could burn, the cattle could scatter, but so long as they still breathed, it wasn't the end. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not just a man of worn lines and quiet strength, but someone who had chosen to stand against his own kind for her sake. It was a truth she could neither deny nor forget. They moved deeper into the desert, finding shelter among the rocks until the night came. The stars blazed overhead, sharp and cold, and the girl wrapped her blanket tighter around herself. She told him then haltingly about her people, about the raid that had torn through the canyon, about the river that nearly claimed her life. She spoke of the lies spread by men like the scarred rider, and of how each false word had been used to justify cruelty. The rancher listened, silent, his eyes on the fire they had built between them. When she finished, he simply nodded, as though carrying her words with him like stones added to his own burdens. He shared too, though his voice was low. He told her of a family long gone, of a wife buried in the dry earth, of wars that had taken neighbors and left only dust. He said he had tried to live apart, tried to escape the tide of blood that swept across the land. But the desert had its own way of pulling men back into its stories. She listened without judgment, hearing the sorrow that weighed on each word. By dawn, the fire at the ranch was little more than a dark scar on the horizon. Smoke still drifted in thin lines, but the worst had passed. The riders were gone, scattered into the wide land. Whether they would return, neither could say. But both knew the desert had shifted beneath them, and nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed were hard. They found what little water they could, hunted when they had to, and leaned on each other more than either wanted to admit. The girl's wounds healed slowly, but her spirit grew stronger. The rancher, though stripped of land and cattle, found a strange kind of renewal in her company. Where once he had lived in silence, now he carried her voice with him, sharp and alive, reminding him that not all was lost. They came at last to the edge of the canyon, where the river wound its way like a silver thread through the stone. She stood on the bank for a long time, remembering the night she had nearly given herself to its current. Then she turned to the rancher and told him she was not ready to leave this world after all. He gave a slow nod, his weathered face softening just enough for her to see the truth of his respect. when they parted, was without bitterness. She told him she had her own path, her own people to find again, or at least to honor. He told her he would rebuild, though not the way before. He would build something smaller, quieter, but stronger in ways no fire could take. They clasped hands, the gesture simple yet full of weight, and then they turned toward their separate horizons. As the girl walked away, her knife at her side and the desert stretching endless ahead, she carried with her the memory of a man who had chosen defiance over silence. As the rancher returned to the smoking ruins of his homestead, he carried with him the image of a girl who had refused to die, who had faced the storm with eyes unyielding. The desert, vast and indifferent, swallowed their footprints quickly. But the story remained, carried in whispers of wind and in the silent endurance of the land itself. It was a story of survival, of mistrust turned to a fragile bond, of a fire that consumed but did not destroy what mattered most. And in the end, both knew the truth that had guided them through the darkest nights that life, no matter how broken, still demanded to be lived. And that courage was not found in victory, but in the choice to stand when the storm bore down. The girl vanished into the horizon, her figure small against the rising sun. The rancher stood for a long while, his hat in his hands, the smoke curling at his back. And when he finally turned to face the future, it was with the quiet strength of a man who had learned, through loss and fire, that hope was as stubborn as the desert itself.